Hello, this is Shawn Kennedy. I'm the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Nursing, and I'm very pleased to be speaking today with Ellen Baer. Ellen is Professor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing in Philadelphia and co-founder and former Associate Director of the university's Barbara Bates Center for the Study of the History of Nursing. And Ellen wrote for our May 2012 issue an article called Key Ideas in Nursing's First Century. So Ellen, welcome.
Well, thank you, Shawn. My pleasure to be with you all.
So it was first of all, thank you for doing this wonderful article that really is a synopsis of nursing's growth and development here in the U.S. for the first 100 years of nursing. And in the article, you say that nursing's growth from, and I loved your statement that nursing was work performed by nice people. Its growth into a skilled profession coming about from evolution through distinct themes. Can you talk a little bit about the themes?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Nursing began as something throughout history that women did in their homes and in their villages. And it wasn't really until the 1800s that it began to be a specialized kind of work. And the reason for that was that people began to work outside of their homes, going to, as the Industrial Revolution started, so that people were not necessarily working at home on a farm or in the village where they grew up or had married into. So they would be going to different locations to work, wherever a city that had industry, and that's when it was necessary to develop systems of taking care of people away from their homes, because they weren't home anymore. And what happened first was that people who got sick in these far-off places were treated very badly and wound up in almshouses or poorhouses or institutions that were called by some of those names, or sometimes hospitals, but there wasn't any care for them there.
So we're talking about people who were not wealthy and didn't have money to hire someone, basically.
That's correct. Right. Yes, I should have made that clear. I'm sorry. Even for people who had money to hire people, there wasn't necessarily anyone to hire. You could hire a nice person to come and help you, but there wasn't necessarily anybody who had any skill to that. And it was really in some of the women's groups in Philadelphia and around the East Coast of America, because that was really all that was developed at that time, that some groups of women started trying to learn better ways to take care of other people. There were nuns that came from Europe. There were groups of women who went to medical school. Believe it or not, there were a couple of women who got into medical school in the 1800s down in Philadelphia and started some training opportunities for other women. So there were different ways that women began to learn how to make poultices, make bandages, apply this knowledge to sick people or whatever. Then the Civil War became a really very drastic way that people were exposed to what could happen to soldiers, and soldiers who not necessarily even got shot or wounded in battle, but who got terrible infections from being out in the cold, from being in situations that weren't clean, getting infections. So the Civil War created more opportunities for, and really needs for, people to learn how to be taken care of. And that was the beginning of things like the American Red Cross and things like that. So this was a movement that came out of need. You've heard that necessity is the mother of invention, and that's what happened with nursing. Nursing was born out of the necessity of all these various factors happening at the same time Civil War, industrialization, the beginning of cities where industries were growing. At the same time, there were many immigrants coming into America, and immigration brought people who didn't speak the language, didn't know the customs, didn't have families to turn to for help when they were sick. So all of these things were happening simultaneously at the last quarter or third of the 19th century. And nursing was one of the responses that developed in society to try to deal with all that. Nursing came then formally when a group that I write about in this article, a group of women in New York came together and started forming visiting societies where they would visit public institutions to focus on care. And they visited a lot of institutions, schools and prisons, but the ones that I focused on in my research were their visits to the hospitals.
Now, were these visits, with these women who made these visits, was this part of a charitable work they were doing, or was it something that they were charged with?
It was part of a charitable work they were doing. At the end of the 1800s, the needs, it's a wonderful quote from Richard Hofstadter about that one of the wonderful parts of American society is the way citizens respond to other people in need. And you know, we still have that in America. We don't realize how unique it is in the world, but it is unique. For instance, with hurricanes and with the tsunamis and all the terrible earthquakes and things that have happened around the world, and American citizens jump in. They send money, they send supplies. That is an American trait that goes way back to the beginning, the founding of the country, and that happened in the end of the 1800s, that because of the Civil War and because of industrialization and cities building and immigrants with nobody to turn to, a lot of ordinary citizens just created groups, charitable groups, to try to help. They were not governmentally sponsored. They weren't even church related. Now, some of them were, but the particular ones I write about in this article were not church related. They were just public do-gooder people. And the group that I particularly focused on was the visiting committee that went to Bellevue Hospital. And the particular woman who I quote in this article is Elizabeth Hobson. I love this Elizabeth Hobson. She describes the experience so vividly of going into these wards and seeing people bleeding and lying in dirty clothes and no one there to take care of them. And she's horrified by it, and she reports back to her committee all of this information, and they all decide to do something about it. They had heard about Florence Nightingale. They wrote to Florence Nightingale. They made an arrangement for one of the young doctors at Bellevue to go over and meet with her and learn how to create a nursing staff to take care of these patients. So her book, she has a whole book. I only quote parts of it, but she describes herself as being a young woman, somewhat newly married, and not very experienced in the world. And when she went into these places, and how horrified she was, and how scared she was. So her book is really riveting, but you can only admire what she ended up doing. I mean, that this young woman, was able to persuade her older colleagues on the committee to try to help, and then from that came the first school of nursing in America at Bellevue. It's really rather astounding.
Yeah, she sounds a little bit how Florence began back in her day.
Yes, the courage of these young women who really, and if we understand the world they were living in, where women really were not allowed to do very much. They weren't allowed to have jobs. They weren't allowed to vote or own property or do things that we now take so for granted. And even without that, those possibilities, they were so courageous that they stood up for things they believed in and made a difference in the world.
And you talk about one of my favorite nurses of the early days, Isabel Hampton Robb, and her organizational skills seem to be her forte.
Yes, in fact, I have a quote in here from, I think it was Adelaide Nutting, who talks about her loving order, that Isabel Hampton wanted everything to be organized. And she did it. I mean, she started as the superintendent of the Johns Hopkins School in the late 1800s, and she, as superintendent of that school, which was the premier school of its time, she ended up organizing meetings that turned into the first meeting of the Superintendent's Society, which would end up being the NLN. She organized the meeting that would turn out to be the first meeting of what ended up being the ANA. She organized the course, which ended up being the first graduate school course for nurses at Teachers College, which, by the way, still goes on today. She organized the group to start the first journal of nursing, which, happily enough, is the one we're talking about, the American Journal of Nursing. And so this was a woman who had a vision. She saw what needed to be done, and again, she got it done. In addition to which, she organized curriculums. She wrote books about curriculum. She organized the first a 2-year curriculum for nursing and then a 3-year curriculum for nursing. She organized such that the group she had arranged, the Superintendent's Society, could impose that curriculum on all the schools, so that ultimately, when a person graduated from a school of nursing, the school had to have had the same curriculum as all the other schools, the same length of time, the same amount of training in different departments, so that being a graduate of a nursing school meant something. You could depend on it, meaning that the person had had training in X, Y, and Z. Because up to that point, anybody could open a nursing school. You could have 4 beds in your home and call it a nursing school and hire 4 people off the street and say that they were nurses. So she also helped develop the movement towards registration, so that people were registered as nurses, that the legislatures of the different states would recognize that to be a nurse you had to go through this curriculum, graduate, take a test, and be certified that you were a certified nurse and not just a person hanging out a shingle.
And yet, I mean, all these things came through her efforts, and of course, with AJN being in print and being a monthly publication since 1900, we, of course, in some of our very early issues, have documentation of a lot of this registration movement. But one of the interesting things is how much of this registration certification Nightingale didn't agree with.
That's correct. I apologize for my other phone ringing. Yes, isn't that interesting? And even some reviewers of this article were astounded at that, and really sort of almost called me to task about it, because people can't believe it. But if you think about Nightingale's idea of nursing, Nightingale thought of it as a calling. And when she used the word calling, she almost meant like a religious vocation. What we would say today, we would use the words almost a religious vocation. She felt that in order to be a nurse, you had to have such a higher level of desire to do good in the world that you didn't need to be certified. Your very aspect of being this person meeting a calling would ensure that you were a special kind of person who would do the right thing, be ethical, learn what you needed to learn to do the job correctly, because all of that would be part of your conscience being brought to bear on your calling. And therefore, to have all these rules about curriculum rules, registration rules, certification, that was implying that the person of themselves didn't have enough moral structure to take care of her own knowledge and her own learning. The other half of that was the power of the matron of the School of Nursing, which is what they called them in England. Mm-hmm. The matron had great power, and she was the one who decided who had reached that level of accomplishment. And if she felt that you hadn't, then you were out. You couldn't get a job, you couldn't graduate, you couldn't finish. But you see, that isn't an American way to do things. I mean, we wouldn't give that kind of power to a third party like that. We would say that isn't fair.
Well, it seemed for many years, though, in some of the nursing schools, the superintendent or the chief nurse certainly did run the schools as if they were kind of religious organizations.
Absolutely.
But you're right, that didn't last.
That didn't last. It's really not the American way. You know, we say that people have the opportunity here to make their own way, and if they meet the requirements and take the tests and pass the tests and do what they have to do to be that kind of whatever the occupation is, then they made it. They did it, and nobody can stand in their way. So it's part of it is the difference between the two cultures, the American culture and the English culture. And it's not just the democratic process that we have in America. It's also a class thing, because in Britain, in England, there's still a lot of class structure, and it isn't possible in England for people from what is considered a lower class background to jump up to a higher class position, whereas in America, you earn your way up. If you do well in school, you can attain the next level, and that's the way it is. So it isn't only the calling aspect, it's also the class structure and then the power allocations in the English structure versus the American structure. So Nightingale didn't agree with the way we ended up doing it in America, and she was sort of mad at us all. And
well, she had to contend with Lavinia Dock.
Yes, well, actually, Hampton was who she had to. Lavinia Dock was Isabel Hampton's second in command at Johns Hopkins, and Hampton was the one who was very polite to Nightingale, but did not allow her positions to be promulgated in the U.S. For instance, at the World's Fair in 1893, which is where many of these speeches and activities took place, and the beginnings of all the things I mentioned, the different societies and all of that, really started at that World's Fair.
Right, you listed several of the presentations by nurses, one of which was Necessity of an American Nurses Association, and this was in 1893, so that's very interesting.
Well, Hampton did not invite Nightingale to speak. She invited Nightingale to submit a paper, which she then read, but she did not read it at the major meetings. She read it at a smaller meeting. So Hampton controlled how much Nightingale would impact the American beginnings of formal nursing in terms of the organizations for superintendents and for the general nurses and all the rest of it.
Oh, that's very interesting. Now, and the other thing that I particularly liked about your article is the progression as society progressed and as women progressed in society. You could see parallel progression within nursing.
That is the whole point of history. We cannot function, no group functions in a vacuum. We are all part of a larger society, and nursing was first of all part of being a woman, and then it became part of a health system and hospitals, and part of how those hospitals and health systems developed, some of which had to do with science. But the thing that I try to make very clear is that science came from the laboratories of Europe. Medicine did not invent science. Science invented medicine. Medicine has captured science in a way, and the practice of medicine gets a lot of credit for the discoveries and the advances that have really come from laboratories, from chemists and physiologists and physicists and pharmacologists. In other words, not medicine, because medicine and nursing are the same. They use those sciences to apply to their practice, but they don't invent those sciences. So the sciences that were being developed in Europe really had major impact on both medicine and nursing in this country, and Hopkins again was the center for that. The Hopkins Medical School was the first school of medicine in America that used the sciences as part of their training, where the students were required to take science. And as I point out in the article, the head of Hopkins also applied that to the nursing school. He said, and the nurses will take the same courses, and he insisted that the nurses have chemistry and pharmacology and all the rest of it as well. So when those sciences were brought to America, they were brought to nursing as well.
That was very forward-thinking at the time.
It was brilliant of him, and brilliant of the whole group at Hopkins, and of course Isabel Hampton was the head of the nursing department there, so she was part of all that. She was quite an amazing person.
She was. I mean, we could talk about this forever, because isn't it great? I find it fascinating.
I do too.
And I love the smaller asides of Lavinia Dock didn't like Elizabeth Hampton Robb's husband, and some of the early letters that in AJN from the early issues, you find small digs in some of the letters that went back and forth.
Well, Lavinia Dock was fabulous.
She was unique.
She was very short. She was about 4'8" or something. But she had this huge brain and this huge heart, and she marched with the suffragettes, and she got
arrested at the White House once, didn't she?
Yes, and she got put in jail for defending women, and she was just this little tiny person who made such a difference. And then of course she was part of Henry Street. She went to Henry Street with Lillian Wald and got that all started, and she was part of all kinds of social reform activities. I don't think that we realize how much reform had to go on in our country to get us into education and science, and get the hospitals cleaned up, and get
most of the public health, when you think about public health and our whole entire health system, when you think about it, came about through nursing leaders, through
That's right.
Rob, who organized the hospitals and applied Nightingale's principles for sanitary conditions,
Yes.
and organized it, and then having Lillian Wald found public health and realizing that you have to treat the family and the community where they are. So it's really the whole system that we have is because of nursing.
And one of my doctoral students down here in Florida did a wonderful dissertation about the Social Security Act and the impact of nurses on that, because Lillian Wald and Lavinia Dock were all part of the group who helped frame some of the Social Security legislation that applied it to the unemployed and people with disabilities, and things like that came from nursing. It's so wonderful.
And
to
now
learn
we're,
these things.
yeah, and I hope our readers and those listening to this podcast will go look at this article, because it's just a fabulous, really just summary of several of these issues, and I would urge people to read this and then do some more exploration of nursing's very rich history, and which I think is now changing again with the impetus of the Future of Nursing report, that it's putting nursing back in the center of health reform. So it's going to be exciting to see how things move forward in the next 5 to 10 years or so.
Absolutely.
Well, Ellen, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to chat with us about the article. It's a fabulous article, and just has so much wonderful, I was going to say news. It's not news, but I think for many nurses who perhaps haven't studied nursing history, it perhaps will give them a new appreciation for
and the
those.
one plug I would put in is for the quote that I use about compassion from Diane Hamilton's work. I love what she wrote about compassion, which I've quoted in this article, and how it's just a very rich theme for us all to grasp in nursing. I think it's so much at the center of what we're all trying to do, and so that would be sort of my final word on it. But I've loved talking to you. I could talk all day, as you can tell.
Well, maybe we'll have to think about a series, an audio series on nursing history.
All right. Well, if there's an interest, I'm always available.
Thank you so much, Ellen.
Thanks, Shawn.